Good afternoon. I'm Elise Bean, Director of the Washington office of the Carl Levin Center for Oversight and Democracy, headquartered at Wayne State University Law School in Detroit. It's my pleasure to welcome you today to a presentation of the paper that won our 4th annual award for excellence in oversight research. The paper is entitled The Rise and Fall of Congressional Oversight of the Bureaucracy, the U.S. House Committee on Energy and Commerce, 1969 to 2018. The author is Professor Jason MacDonald. Before saying more about him, I'd like to just say a word about the award itself. The Levin Center established this award to encourage and recognize scholarly contributions to the emerging field of oversight research. We believe that the job of lawmakers in Congress or state capitol is to act as the eyes and voice of their constituents, investigate key problems besetting their communities, get to the heart of those problems by digging into the facts, and then share what they've learned with the American people. As our founder and namesake, the late Carl Levin, used to say, you can't have good government without good oversight. And the same holds true for democracy. That's why the center's mission is to strengthen fact-based, bipartisan oversight by our elected leaders. And part of accomplishing that objective is to attract scholars to the field to help us understand the oversight process, measure its effectiveness, mark how it changes over time, and figure out how it can be improved. That's what the Levin Center Award for Excellence in Oversight Research is all about. Each year, a selection committee with political science scholars and veteran oversight practitioners review submissions. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. So they review submissions to select the paper that best addresses significant legislative oversight issues at the federal, state, or international level. We hope that all of you listening today will consider competing for the next year's award, which comes, by the way, with a cash prize of $2,500. The deadline is June 1st. For more information, please visit our website as indicated in the chat. So now let me introduce, again, Professor Jason MacDonald, who teaches political science at West Virginia University, has delved deeper than most into the oversight ways of Congress, and has written a paper that explores 50 years of oversight history at the House Committee on Energy and Commerce. To add to his presentation, we also welcome Professor Sean Theriault, who teaches political science at the University of Texas, is a recognized expert on Congress, and is currently serving as the Levin Center's year-long oversight scholar. With that, let me congratulate Professor MacDonald, thank Professor Theriault, and turn things over to Jason to get started.
Thanks, Elise. I'm just going to share some slides. And again, thank you. The Levin Center has been pivotal in not only encouraging scholars to study oversight, but to subsidize the study of oversight, to make it worth our while. And I'm delighted to present my paper that was published in the Journal of Political Institutions and Political Economy. And the way I think about oversight is, and this is consistent with the Levin Center's prioritization of it, is that it is a mechanism that allows legislatures to promote democracy. And I think that increasingly I've been thinking about it in terms of Dahl's discussion of democracy and democracy and its critics. And he conceptualizes of democracy as a web. And one end of the web are theoretical concerns, philosophical concerns about what democracy should be. And on another end of the web, a three-dimensional web, there are empirical arguments about what constitutes democracy. And critics of democracy, maybe in wanting to throw the baby out with the bathwater and replace it with something else, sometimes make the argument that democracy doesn't realize its theoretical or its philosophical mandates and practice. One of the points that Dahl makes is that institutions, democratic institutions, can try to make improvements in order to answer these critics and to make their criticisms less powerful, less apt. And that's really where I see democracy, that's where I really see oversight serving democracy. And we see that in the US Congress across time, where Congress tries to influence policy decisions that are made by bureaucracy because delegation has to occur to the bureaucracy. And when delegation occurs, there's some opportunity there for agencies to make decisions differently than what the elected legislature calls for. Now, that's imperfect, and that's something that is subject to criticism, but through oversight, it can be minimized. And then oversight also helps Congress foster the legislative capacity and power to counteract an increasingly strong executive. And so the inside baseball of this project was that I had the good fortune over the years to interview for, not necessarily specifically for this project, but for other projects on oversight and on appropriations. I've had the good fortune to interview committee staff members, people like Elise, who spent their careers doing a lot of oversight, and a number of their comments. And actually, I mean, I think it's kind of a uniform, unanimous view that oversight has decreased, in their opinion, since they were working in the 1980s, 1990s. Some of the staffers that I spoke with who worked for Representative Dingell, and that their view is that it's decreased. And I believe them. They are really well positioned and expert and know a lot about what happens in Washington, D.C. and what happens in Congress. But that theme, I don't think, is really reflected or has not been reflected in research on oversight. Research on oversight emphasizes that oversight increases under divided government, decreases under unified government, and that's not all that we know. But that's a big contribution. And I think that's a compelling and correct explanation for why oversight varies. And then there's also research on non-legislative hearings, though. So Congress can have committees can have legislative and non-legislative hearings. And one thing that we know from work by Jonathan Llewellyn is that as it's become more difficult to pass legislation, committees have held more non-legislative hearings, and non-legislative hearings may or may not include a lot of oversight. So maybe oversight really hasn't declined, and I've just been told that it is. So one question is, has it declined? And I would say that there's a need. I believe that there was a need for a description, so I described it. And I focused on the House Energy and Commerce Committee because I really wanted to say something substantial and comprehensive about one committee's work. And I wanted to do it across a large period of time, because if you just look from 2001 to 2023, you might be missing something. You might have missed a diminution of oversight during the 1980s or 1990s. So I wanted to go back, and in particular, I wanted to go back to the period before the Legislative Reorganization Act was passed in 1970, when there was probably less oversight in the 1960s, which is a point that Sean has made in The Great Broadening with his co-authors in that book, that there was a burst of legislative productivity to address problems, and then subsequently oversight followed. So the expectation was you'd see a lot of oversight, and then maybe a decrease in oversight. And so what I did is I wanted to know what was happening in these non-legislative hearings, because that's where oversight would be occurring, if it is. And it's also the possibility that there could be a lot of non-legislative hearings without any oversight in them. And so what I did is I read a lot of opening statements from House Energy and Commerce non-legislative hearings. I looked at all 143 opening statements. And by opening statements, what I mean is the statement made by the committee or subcommittee chair prior to the witnesses testifying and being asked questions. And this statement provides a lot of information about what the hearing is going to be about. And I have a 4 pages in the appendix to this article, appendix 2 of the article that's available through the journal online, and I can make it available to people as well, in which I provide coding rules for the content analysis of these opening statements. So I read them. And then I also read a stratified random sample. What I did is I took 15 hearings from each session, from the 91st Congress through the 115th Congress. And I had over 2,700 hearings from which I collected data from the House Energy and Commerce non-legislative hearings. And so I read the opening statements of 365. And of course, there's some overlap there. I read 15 hearings from the 100th Congress as well, and that's in that 365. So what is, having read all these hearings, what are these non-legislative hearings all about, and to what degree does oversight occur within them? So what we see here is, so I discerned from reading these hundreds of hearings that there were really 4 types of hearings. One was there was no oversight in the hearing. And when I say oversight in this paper, I'm referring specifically to scrutiny. I'm defining it as scrutiny of agency policymaking, agency policy decisions, and perhaps attempts to reverse these decisions. And I recognize that committees do a lot of important work monitoring policy outcomes in their jurisdiction, monitoring the behavior of private actors that can be harmful to the public. And I recognize that this work is a public good, and I'm happy to talk more about that. But so in this paper, more traditionally though, well, within the research literature on political science, political scientists have talked about oversight as a focus on the bureaucracy, and that's pretty clear, and I make that point in the paper. So when I say no oversight, what I'm talking about is no scrutiny of agency decisions in these hearings. And this is, for the 100th Congress, it was about 40%, and for the full sample, it was about 45% of hearings involved no scrutiny. Non-legislative hearings involved no scrutiny of agency decisions. Some hearings, about 1/10 in the 100th Congress and a little under 1/10 in the full sample, involve a little bit of oversight, but the primary focus of the hearing was to examine some problem or issue. Then there are hearings where clearly the primary purpose of the hearing is to scrutinize agency decisions. That's why they're in the room. They're examining what agencies have done and why they've done it. They're asking bureaucrats questions, and they're getting to the bottom of things and trying to sometimes change what agencies do. And then there is a small percentage of hearings that involve cheerleading or advocacy for programs. So from this, I argue in the paper, it's a contribution. It's a useful description to note what's happening in these hearings. That nearly half of non-legislative hearings don't involve scrutiny of agency decisions. And if what we want to do is we want to understand how much oversight of the bureaucracy is occurring over time, we might be wary about using counts of non-legislative hearings. Now, if non-legislative hearings, if the percentage of hearings that are oversight of the bureaucracy in non-legislative hearings is the same, if it's uniform across time, then you can do that. But if in more recent years, there's the non-legislative hearings are not focused on scrutinizing agency decisions, but they're more focused on, or less focused on scrutinizing agency decisions and more focused on just examining problems. Like, for example, we're going to have a hearing on drones. We're going to talk about drones. We're not going to have the Federal Aviation Administration in. We're going to have a hearing about drones. We're going to hear what trade associations think of drones. If there's more of those hearings in recent years than there are in the past, then simply by counting non-legislative hearings over years, that might not be an accurate indicator if what we're interested in doing is charting how much oversight occurs over time. What we should do is we should be looking at an indicator that more precisely tells us when Congress is scrutinizing agency decisions. And what I propose to do that is I propose in the paper to examine the volume of testimony by executive branch personnel, because when executive branch personnel are there, they're going to be asked questions about what is happening in their agencies. They have the best knowledge, the most proximate knowledge about the bases for decisions that are made, policy decisions made in the bureaucracy. And it is the case that trade associations, and sorry about the misspelling there, I just noticed it. The trade associations are able to, as McCubbins and Schwartz famously put it in their article on fire alarms, they're able to pull a fire alarm and tell Congress that there's a problem in the agency, but they don't know what started the fire. They don't have direct knowledge of what is occurring in the agency. If you want direct knowledge of what's occurring in the agency, you need to pull in agency personnel. I argue. I say that on its face, from a face validity standpoint, it makes sense to examine the number of bureaucratic personnel across time and as an indicator of how much scrutiny of agency decisions is occurring. And it's not enough, though, to say that this makes sense. If I'm going to spend my time on doing this, I want to make sure that I'm right. So what I did is I evaluated the construct validity of that variable, the number of executive branch personnel. And what that means is, is that indicator associated in a way that I would think it should be with a variable that definitely, with the probability of 1, indicates the presence of oversight. And so as it happens, for 365 hearings from the sample of 25 years, and for 143 hearings from the 100th Congress, I went through and I read these opening statements, and I know for sure whether these hearings involve the scrutiny of agency decisions. So is it the case that these hearings, when they involved scrutiny of agency decisions, had a higher number of bureaucratic personnel testifying in them, and in hearings where Congress was examining problems generally, were there fewer executive branch personnel? And so what I did is I estimated logit models, and these models are reported in table 2 of the paper. And what they demonstrate is there's a substantively large and statistically significant association between the number of executive branch witnesses and the probability that that these 143 hearings in the 100th Congress and these 365 hearings in the full sample, that they involve scrutiny of agency decisions. The more executive branch witnesses, the more likely it was that the hearing involved oversight of bureaucratic policymaking. And so I argue that the empirical models in table 2 validate that variable, and then what that does. And so figure one charts the substantive magnitude of the effect. And that is, as the number of executive branch personnel testifying, you see large increases in the probability that a hearing was oversight of the bureaucracy. And so what that allows me to do, I argue, is to use this indicator and chart it across time. And that's what I do in figure 2 of the paper. So the solid line here is the number of non-legislative hearings, and the dotted line is the number of bureaucratic personnel. And I argue that the dotted line of bureaucratic personnel is the best indicator that I have of how much oversight of bureaucratic decisions is occurring by the House Energy and Commerce Committee over this 50-year period, in any 2-year period, in any session of Congress. And so what do we see? Well, we see an explosion of oversight after the Legislative Reorganization Act and after the burst of legislative activity during the great broadening that Sean and his co-authors document. And that's what we would expect. And so that's one thing that we see. Another thing that we see is we see a decrease starting in the late 1980s. If you look, so the 101st Congress occurred from 1989 to 1990, and you see a large decrease from about over 450 personnel to 300 personnel, a substantial decrease. And then it never increased again. The number of bureaucratic personnel, and again, this is an indicator of oversight, never increased again. It continued to decline. And by the early 1980s, it was about a third of the level that it was in the late 70s, early 80s. And another point I would make is that for a long time, it was the case that the number of bureaucratic personnel testifying tracked the number of non-legislative hearings. The solid line and the dashed line are essentially hugging one another, but then they kind of dance away from one another. And as Congress increases the number of as the Energy and Commerce Committee increased the number of non-legislative hearings it held from the 1990s into the 21st century, the number of bureaucratic personnel testifying decreased. And so what happened? One answer is I don't know. I don't know why that is the case. This manuscript is about description, not explanation. And I think explanation is paramount. And that's a point that I want to end on. I want to move forward in this research and encourage others to move forward in this research with the support, probably some support, a lot of support from the Levin Center. And I want to note that one thing I want to note for people is that this decrease in oversight occurred before staffing cuts that occurred in 1995 when the 104th Congress decided to decrease the ability of the institution to engage in oversight by cutting staff. Another thing I want to focus on is that this diminution of oversight that we see that started in the 1980s and continued unabated for Energy and Commerce, and of course it's an open question as to whether this occurred in other committees. This occurred across many transitions from unified to divided government, and a big theoretical explanation in the literature is that divided government is really important, policy disagreement is really important across branches, and that is the case, and I think that's compelling and correct. But I think it seems to me that what's really important to understand is this continued decrease. And then another real incredibly important question is what's happening in these non-legislative hearings where Congress is examining problems and issues? Are they having hearings on drones, or are the committees engaging in investigations that one could say is a public good for the entire Congress? So, except for the entire country. So with that, I'm really looking forward to Sean's comments. One thing I should say in closing, though, is I really appreciate the review process at JPIPE, the Journal of Political Institutions and Political Economy. One of the things I told the editor, Jeff Jenkins, is that my initial submission to JPIPE would not have won this award. So I benefited from the review process there tremendously. And and from the comments of other scholars. So thank you.
Thanks, Jason, for that really interesting presentation, and congrats on the award. Before you and I have a little bit of a back and forth, I thought that I would do two things. The first thing I want to do is I want to compliment, as you did, the Levin Center. It's only because of all the hard work that Elise Bean and the folks at the Levin Center have done. They have really put oversight much more in the wheelhouse of congressional scholarship. And so kudos to them for all of the investments that they make in their time and energy to get us thinking about oversight in a much more systematic way. And I think your paper just does a beautiful job of kind of taking us to that next level of thinking about oversight scholarship. Right, to situate a little bit more broadly, if we think about the congressional literature over the last, 50 years or so, is really dominated by roll call behavior. And that never really made that much sense. Of course, we should pay attention to what happens on the floor, but we've known for so long that the most important things that Congress does is what they do in their committee hearings, in committees. And so what I like is this new focus that we're starting to have on these hearings. And initially, we used to think that all these hearings were going to be legislative hearings, right? Because we were so floor oriented. And so what I really like about this paper, Jason, is that you're having us think about what it is that they're doing in the hearings that is apart from legislative responsibilities. And also, you're starting to get us to think a little bit more about what it is that they're doing when they're not doing oversight. And so I like, right, I think that you were probably surprised by your results. And then, right, where you left off, I just think that, that this paper is the best of what social science is all about, right? You made a new discovery about what actually they do in these hearings, but you're not providing much explanation. And you're like, but first we need to know what the discovery is before we can start trying to figure out why we have that discovery. And so I'm really grateful, as you right noted, to the journal for publishing a paper, because sometimes they want us to get all the way to the end before, right, they even allow us to talk about what our discoveries are. And so kudos to them for publishing this paper, which I think that even you would admit is like halfway to an answer, right? Like, I don't think that, right, we know everything. And I think this paper pushes us along in trying to figure out some stuff. And so congrats to you, and congrats to the journal for publishing it. The last thing I would say, right, like before I start asking Jason more questions, is that I really like the nitty-gritty, the qualitative aspects of this paper. I like that Jason spent time reading the opening statements, trying to come up with some type of classification scheme so that we can try and understand these hearings in a little bit more systematic way. I think it's so helpful to think about the data generating mechanism behind the kinds of hearings that committees have. And I think Jason's paper does a really nice job in pushing us to think about, all right, what is it that Congress is trying to do with these hearings? And how can we measure that across time? And what does that say about the institution, or about what committees are doing within the institution? And just one other right side note, I would encourage people to look at Maya Kornberg's good book on committees, because she goes into the nitty gritty of, right, how hearings get organized and how they get implemented. And I think anyone that wants to study what committees are doing, and especially through the lens of what the hearings that they have, should spend some time looking at Maya's book on it. So with that, I would encourage people who are in the room at the Levin Center, and those of us who are joining us online, if they have any questions for Jason whatsoever, they should put them in Q&A. Otherwise, you're just going to hear a conversation between the two of us, which I'm always pleased to have. Sometimes it's in the gym at the Palmer House when we're both at the Midwest, or right in the lobby, or happy to engage in it. But Jason, I thought that I would start kind of just defining our parameters a little bit here. Right. So one of your categories you list is, right, you label hearings that were to learn about problems and issues as containing no oversight. And so I just wanted you to talk a little bit about what it is exactly you mean by oversight.
What I mean is, by bureaucratic oversight, is that Congress is scrutinizing the policy decisions made by agencies, and in some cases, trying to reverse them, trying to learn about what decisions agencies have made. Sometimes the committee will, and this is really interesting to me, what the committee will do. And it's interesting to me because political scientists stress that the committee has less information about policy than agencies, that there's an information asymmetry. And so Congress is at a disadvantage. But it occurs to me that through some of the work that congressional committees do, in some cases, they actually learn as much, if not more, about a policy challenge than a bureaucratic agency with jurisdiction has. And I think I'm not sure that's true. Maybe that's some speculation on my part. So it seems to me that one example is under John Dingell, the Energy and Commerce Committee engaged in a series of hearings examining a problem of auditing of corporations. That the view was that the public and investors should not be confident in how much these corporations are valued at because of really poor accounting practices. And this was and so Dingell wasn't reviewing decisions that were being made in the Securities and Exchange Commission. And in fact, the committee personnel may have known more about the problem than the Securities and Exchange Commission knew. And so that's very valuable. And it's a public good to citizens, to investors, to people who rely on a vibrant economy, and good information about the valuation of companies, right? But it's not bureaucratic oversight. Bureaucratic oversight is scrutinizing these decisions, and that's what I'm studying here. But I think it's going to be really valuable. I think one thing that we might do is look at that category of no oversight, examination of problems and issues, and then subdivide it further. Like what's going on? To what degree is there public goods provision in these no oversight hearings? Or to what degree is Congress, as Mayhew put it, in servicing the organized, as he put it in Congress, the Electoral Connection? And
Right.
are they servicing? Are they servicing factions, as Madison put it in Federalist 10, or are they working for the public as a whole to solve problems, to get information to solve problems?
Right. And I think another interesting question is the sequencing of these things, right? Is it they're calling in the drone manufacturers before they call in the bureaucratic agencies that might have, right, the jurisdiction over it, so that they can learn about the problem before they can start directing bureaucratic agencies about what they want to do? Have you given any thought to that? Right. Like, so first there is, right, they're just gathering information, and then they're calling in the experts, right, in the bureaucracy. Do you see any of that kind of sequencing in your data set?
I don't think the way my data set's set up, I don't think I can answer that question. I think that's a good comment. I think it's a good comment for me. And it's a good comment for others who want to work on this.
Right.
So
Let's talk a little bit more about, right, like I know that, right, you use the term very specifically, bureaucratic oversight. Let's talk a little bit more about private sector oversight. Right, how much, right, and I know that, right, you know a lot beyond what you've written in this paper. Do you see much evidence that you would expect the same sorts of trends that you've seen with bureaucratic oversight as you would see with private sector oversight?
I think that, I mean, if the proportion of non-legislative hearings that are bureaucratic oversight is decreased, then what that leaves is a higher proportion of these hearings to be in something else. And based on my classification, I would expect that to be the examination of problems and issues. And so some of the examination of problems and issues might be investigating. So what do you mean by private sector oversight? I mean, so if we're learning about how drones work, is that oversight? Or for it to be private sector oversight, do we have to be examining, for lack of a better word, wrongdoing that is harmful to citizens and consumers, the pollution of the water table and matters like that? Or is it, I mean, is that, I would certainly regard that as private sector oversight. But would we think about private sector oversight as also being, well, we're going to learn about drones because this is a valuable area of commerce moving forward, and it's going to stimulate the economy, and there's going to be all sorts of benefits, from commercial benefits from drones, and that's a public good as well. I mean, certainly it was the case that Congressman Dingell tried to be an advocate for industry in some of the hearings that he oversaw in the 1980s, that he oversaw himself, or that other subcommittees oversaw. He tried to get the ball rolling on the development of industrial policy in the late 70s, early 80s, an effort which did not come to fruition. He also intervened in trade disputes where American companies their patents were being violated by businesses in other countries, and he thought that hurt American businesses and the American economy. And I don't know if that's private sector oversight. That might be more advocacy, and that might go in the advocacy category.
No, right, and that's the difficult thing here is, right, it's unclear if if Congress is trying to gain information to ultimately develop legislation, if they're just trying to gain this information, perhaps to try and force bureaucrats to move in one direction or another direction. But I think, right, digging into the hearings as you've done, right, just pushes us down the field in such a nice way. And so kudos to you for at least getting that conversation started. Before we leave the entire kind of definition of oversight and some of the broader things aside, right, the difficulty with studying oversight is that we don't know if the absence of oversight hearings means that Congress is perfectly doing its job, because bureaucrats are so scared that they're not going to do anything against what Congress would intend to do. And so they're going to follow the line exactly on Congress. Or if the absence of oversight hearings means that Congress is utterly failing at its job because it's not doing one of the most important things that it needs to do, which is making sure the bureaucrats aren't rogue operators in our government. In your studying of the opening statements, do you see much evidence can speak to this debate about the frequency of oversight?
The specific issue of that the absence of oversight does not mean the absence of influence.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah, that's a point that what the Weingast and Moran made in the early 1980s, and I guess I would make the point qualitatively that, I mean, having spoken with committee staffers who worked on the Hill for decades, people like Elise, that they don't believe that, right? That's my impression from talking to them. And I think that my impression is that they do not think, and maybe we'll give Elise the opportunity because she knows better than I do, but they do not think that Congress, if they're not holding hearings, if it's not holding hearings, if it's not doing a lot of oversight, they don't think agencies are going to be responsive.
No, I think that's fair. I think it's really helpful, though, to have, right, your expertise speak to this, right, debate, even if the debate is now 40 years old. And I said we were going to move on, but there's one more, right? There's a question, I think, that's related, that's coming from Amelia DeSanto. She first thanks you and the Levin Center, but then she says that hearings is just one of the things that committees can do. And I'm going to ask you a question, and then I might even help you answer it. But I'm going to give you first crack at it. So is there any consideration being given to looking at congressional oversight that does not result in a hearing? And can you speak to that question at all, Jason?
I think it's harder to do because it's impossible to see what happens behind closed doors. There are one effort that I've made is to examine reports, committee reports issued by Energy and Commerce, and again, consistent with one of the themes of this panel is the Levin Center has done a lot to subsidize the dissemination of oversight reports, and so the House Energy and Commerce Committee went out of its way to type up voluminous reports starting in the early 80s through the early 90s, where they just documented everything that they did. And it included a lot of discussion of interactions that committee staff had with agency personnel that occurred outside of the hearing rooms. So that's an opportunity to look at that systematically, and I may do that. So I think that's an excellent suggestion. And there's been other work done by Kenny Lawande and on researching communication that bureaucratic personnel that Congress has by members making requests specifically to bureaucratic personnel outside of committee hearings. So there's other work on that.
Yeah. And I'm going to throw
Melinda Ritchie, of course.
Yeah, I was going to throw out Molly Ritchie's name too.
It would be a crime for me to. That's one risk you do when you start mentioning people is you're going to forget. So fortunately, I didn't forget that one.
No, for sure, because her book is just fantastic on this entire question, as is Kenny's research. And I'm glad that you mentioned the congressional reports. And part of the reason that I wanted to ask Amelia's question is in part because the Levin Center is doing so much right now in gathering all of those congressional reports from all of the different committees. And so we're hopeful that, maybe by the end of the year or so, we're going to have an entire rollout through the Levin Center of all of the congressional reports. Right now, we feel pretty good about the database for the oversight committees, but there are a lot more committees in Congress that do oversight than just the oversight committees. And so I look forward to the development of that part of the Levin Center's project there. Right, you've mentioned him a couple of times, and I've been biting my tongue because, right, you and I could talk about John Dingell the rest of the day. But right, so let's just dive in, right? John, you can't think about the Energy and Commerce Committee during this time period that you're studying without thinking of John Dingell. I mean, this guy dominated that committee in such a way that he really made it one of the very most important committees on Capitol Hill. In one of the ways in which he did this, and he readily admits this, is that he would try to claim the jurisdiction from other committees. And so, right, if he didn't have the oversight responsibility of the bureaucratic agency, what he would do first is he would start holding fact-finding missions. He would bring in people to just gather more information. And so he would be gathering that information. And then when there was some type of jurisdictional dispute between his committee and another committee, he'd say, we have some grounds here to have this bill referred to us because we've been holding all of these fact-finding missions. We've been engaging in all of these hearings that that in your schema, you wouldn't advertise as overseeing, but yet his long game is trying to make a play to try and get at that. And so I wonder if you could, like in reading your opening statements or in analyzing the types of hearings, are you seeing kind of the strategy of John Dingell of trying, before I turn over, one of my favorite John Dingell quotes is he thought that everything was under the jurisdiction of Energy and Commerce, because as he would say, if it moves, it's energy, and if it doesn't, it's commerce. And so that's just how expansive he thought his committee's jurisdiction should be. Are you seeing much of that in what you're analyzing here in this paper?
I should say, before I answer that question, that in David King's book, Turf Wars, he quotes Dingell as looking at a map of the world and saying, that's my jurisdiction. So along the lines of your observation. What you see in a lot of cases is you see the efforts to legislate in the wake of oversight, in the wake of investigations. You see efforts to pass legislation. So the House passed a bill to amend corporate auditing standards that failed in the Senate, but passed a bill. You saw there was a massive investigation of counterfeit fasteners in the 1980s. I guess counterfeit fasteners were just a problem threatening public health and national security. I guess the Nuclear Regulatory Commission did a study and found that 9 or 10% of the high grade strength, the strongest fasteners that you need and nuclear power plants were counterfeit and not capable of doing their jobs. And so after this investigation, there was legislation to, as you said, there was a massive amount, there were a number of hearings on the matter, and they got a lot of information. They had people from the Customs Service in because it would be their job to intercept these fasteners. They had people from the military in, they had people from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in. State governments testified. They got all this information. They wrote a bill, and it was enacted into law in the wake of oversight. And I don't know in that case if it expanded the committee's jurisdiction, but it was I guess I would say it was the basis for legislating, and certainly it had the potential to expand the committee's jurisdiction.
Right. And so, thinking about, John Dingell, how important do you think his leadership was in kind of establishing, the exceptionalism, I guess, of Energy and Commerce, at least in this regard?
I think there are other committees that engaged in vibrant oversight during that era, and that in their committees today that engage in more oversight than some other committees. So the way I take your question is what explains variance in oversight, and then we might also start to think about what explains variance in the quality of oversight. And those are, that's something that might be difficult to measure. But I think, yeah, having talked to a lot of staffers, they believed that Dingell's attention, his prioritization of the matter it was a necessary condition, maybe and maybe even a sufficient condition, that if you get a committee chair with control of the gavel and with a staff, maybe that's even a sufficient condition to engage in productive and useful oversight, useful from the standpoint of figuring out what's going on in agencies, and from the standpoint of learning about problems and issues, and holding predations against consumers to account, and also sometimes advocating on behalf of industry in order to promote economic vitality. That it's an important role in order to have people. In order to have that, you need people like Dingell, and maybe he was one of the biggest advocates along those lines. And also, I mean, to get back to praising the Levin Center, that's something that it tries to do. It tries to convince people to be more like Dingell and Carl Levin.
Right, because part of their whole portfolio is to teach people how to do oversight.
Yes,
right?
yeah,
It's not enough,
yes, thank
right?
you.
To demand that people do oversight, but right, there's a way of doing good oversight and there's a way of doing bad oversight. And Jason, you just opened yourself up for this question though, because you said like measures of quality oversight. So I want you to take a stab at, right, like how is it that we as scholars can begin to think about, right, what effective oversight looks like, or what quality oversight looks like, versus just, right, a hearing on oversight?
Well, I think that other scholars are working to do that right now. I know Kenny Lawande and his co-authors, and as well as Julia Park and you and Dan have papers examining discourse using machine learning and computer algorithms to examine text, and to figure out in the degree to which committees are developing and seeking expert information versus engaging in other maybe political grandstanding. And I would say other people are doing that better than me. And they've also you've also recognized them and supported them.
Mm.
You being the Levin Center.
Right.
So I would say people are doing it.
No, that's right. It truly does take a village in this regard, right? Because I think that some of those people that you mentioned, right, and I would throw out Julia Park's name as another person, and Ha-Young Yu and Pamela Bond, right, really looking at kind of giving us new insights into oversight. But having people
I understand that you're writing a paper too.
Right. Indeed. We're all part of that community, Jason. So more about John Dingell. How important was it that Tom Bliley had been a long-serving Energy and Commerce member, taking the reins from Dingell when the Republicans take over in 1994? How important do you think their relationship was in kind of easing that transition for Energy and Commerce, going from a Democratic majority institution to a Republican majority institution?
That's a good question. I mean, I think if you look at the figure 2, if you look at the data, I guess you don't see Energy and Commerce falling off the cliff immediately from the 104th Congress, 1993-94 to 95-96, in terms of the volume of oversight that was done. And I know that there were a number of laws that were enacted under Bliley, and work that was done on chemical manufacturing, the application of chemicals to upholstered furniture. And so certainly it was the case that Bliley was a long-term member of Energy and Commerce, and was immersed in its culture. And
No, that's exactly where I was hoping you're going, right? Because sometimes I think we as scholars sometimes want to say, all right, there's the Dingell regime, and then there's the Bliley regime, and then there's a new regime. But right, these things have, right, there's not, it's hard for us to come up with beginning and ending dates, right? Because these things bleed, right, into different kind of chairmanships and the relationships that individual members have. Before we leave this line of questioning completely, just one more question. How, right, I used the term the exceptionalism of energy and commerce earlier. Yeah, right. I know it's beyond this paper, but how exceptional do you think energy and commerce is? Like, do you expect like other committees, right? The big committees, we'd see this similar trends that you're outlining in this paper?
Well, I'm working on answering that question right now in a manuscript with Nikki Caleb Hughes of Bowling Green State University. And what we were doing is we're working on expanding the data set to other House and Senate committees to see if the trends are similar.
Mm.
And that is if there was as much oversight in these other committees as there was in energy and commerce in the late 70s and early to mid 80s, and if it also decreased. So, I mean, rather than, the answer right now is I don't know.
Come on, you've peeked at the data.
I haven't.
Okay.
I literally don't have it.
All right.
We're in the process of getting it.
All right. Well, we'll stay tuned for that paper.
Thanks. I should say thank you for the conversation, and I value the opportunity to try and keep up with you. And I hope I did so. I know I did so here more so than if we had gone for a run. I wouldn't have been able to keep up at all.
We have a couple of questions that have come in from the people attending. So the first one is that your paper found that longer hearings were an indicator of oversight hearings. How reliable was it as an indicator? What's the significance of that finding? Does it mean that oversight hearings are more complex, more detailed, more combative? And maybe, right, this isn't part of the question, but I'll add, right, one of the things that we find in the Great Broadening is that, right, while the amount of legislation goes down, right, the number of pages that are passed per piece of legislation goes way up. And so, right, it's kind of, right, if we look at one measure, we see a decrease in oversight, but maybe we're having much more, right, longer oversight hearings now, or more complex ones, or more detailed.
Well, so across all the specifications, I do observe that the number of pages is associated with the probability that the hearing is oversight. So to me, that suggests that when the committee has decided it's going to do oversight, the realization of that is a longer hearing. That's the case. I include fixed effects across sessions. So that's going to be the case in recent years as well as in the past. So I'd say it's consistent.
Yeah. Another question from the audience that I think is pretty insightful. It says, I wonder if the rise of easily accessible online records correlates with the reduction of physically calling executive bureaucrats. Congress doesn't call them because they feel that they already see all the information, right? And we know that, right, from the good work that John Wilkerson and Scott Adler have done, right, the regular reporting requirements and the and sunset legislation and reauthorizations, like is Congress better attuned to oversight these days just because of the mechanisms that they've learned over time?
I don't see how they could be. I mean, they have fewer people working there than they used to. And that there is, I guess one could make the argument, I think that the onus would be on the person making that argument, but that somehow it's more efficient. Somehow, maybe it's the case that fewer legislative staffers are able to process more information because it's more efficient and then communicate it to members. My intuition is no, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, right. And right, we've opened the conversation ever so delicately into congressional capacity, right? I think one of the big findings in your paper was that we would have expected that when Congress was endowing itself with lots of staff and lots of people to engage in the oversight, that we'd expect lots of hearings. And then when the Republicans and Newt Gingrich come in 1995 and they cut staff and they cut the Office of Technology Assessment and those other kind of support agencies, that we would expect the decrease then in 1995. But right, as you've shown in your presentation and the paper so clearly, right, the drop off happens before. So, right, could you speak a little bit to the, right, is Congress appropriately arming itself to continue doing research at the level that John Dingell was back in the 1980s and 90s?
Well, and that was a period when Dingell was still chair.
Right.
Right. His subcommittee chairs were doing less scrutiny, were engaging in less scrutiny of agency decisions. And we also saw less output in terms of non-legislative hearings. And so a question is, well, were there different subcommittee chairs? Were some subcommittee chairs moving on? We know James Theriault was really active, for example, as subcommittee chair of the Consumer Affairs Committee. And then he went off to be governor of New Jersey for one term, raised taxes, and then was no longer governor of New Jersey. But he was someone that was a mini Dingell, a junior Dingell. And so were these individuals replaced with people who, with congresspersons who were less, for whatever reason, for what reason we don't know, who prioritized oversight less?
Yeah, I mean, if you were serving on Energy and Commerce back in the 1980s, you didn't think John Dingell was going anywhere anytime soon. And so, right, if you wanted to become, right, the ever important chair of a committee, you might start looking, right, elsewhere. And so it's, right, it's interesting. I mean, I wonder, I don't know to what extent Theriault is running for governor of New Jersey as a way of accruing more power, because he saw, right, at least the chairmanship for the committee that he really wanted was going to be blocked at least as long as Dingell was there. And I wonder, right, what that means for the term limits that Republicans put on their committee chairs, right? Does that mean that some of these people who eventually want to accrue this power, and so, right, they'll stick around longer because they know that they could get their shot at some point?
That's interesting. I've always thought that term limits might diminish the incentive to engage in oversight, because if you know you're not going to be there for a long time, that there's less of a point in becoming an expert.
Right. I mean, maybe, right? Or you could know that when it's your time, you get 6 years. And so, right, you're going to try to do everything in your power to make those 6 years push the committee off in the direction that you think it ought to be heading. So, Jason, go ahead.
Well, yeah, if it's the case that the committee can do good work during those 6 years.
Right. Right. And right, the Republicans, right, they hamstring themselves a bit because it doesn't matter if they're in the minority or the majority, right? So it could be that there's 6 years of heading the committee. It could be that 4 of those years are in the minority, in which case, right, they're not exercising much power whatsoever. And so then what you thought was going to be a 6-year window just shrinks to a 2-year window.
Absolutely. I mean, when I was taking classes on Congress and as an undergraduate, I learned about the permanent Republican minority in the House, right? And but it was true. I mean, the Democrats had every expectation that they would be in control of the House for a long time. So if you were chair, or if you were subcommittee chair, you're going to be able to do these hearings for as long as you wanted. And so it made sense to invest in the infrastructure to do it. Now, and Francis Lee talks about this and making a larger point about the basis for polarization. But now you might be out in 2 years. So why invest in doing a lot of research on what's happening in agencies to influence policy 2 and 3 years from now, because we might not be in power 2 or 3 years from now. Which suggests me, from a reform standpoint, if we're interested in reform to bolster oversight, you might want and I don't know that members of Congress would be especially interested in this possibility, but it suggests that you might want a more professional staff, like a more professional permanent staff on these committees, like they have in the Library of Congress.
Right. I don't know if she showed her face because she wants to wrap things up, and if that's fine. But what I do want to say is one of the points that I've heard at least make a million times is that good oversight is bipartisan oversight. And so, right, what she would argue, I would think, and she can she can counter me, but right, the flipping from right Democrat to Republican majorities shouldn't matter if oversight is being done in a bipartisan fashion, because then you're just right merely passing the gavel off. But yet, if you're engaging in bipartisan oversight, then you've developed those relationships so that it shouldn't be as jarring as it would be if you're not doing bipartisan oversight.
I guess I'm going to interrupt here and say, yes, I agree with that. This has been such a fabulous discussion. We've talked about oversight in terms of what exactly counts as oversight, the role of leadership, how do you measure effectiveness? What about non-hearing oversight? How do we look at that and how do we coordinate it with hearings? Are there sequencing in hearings that may make something look like it's not oversight, but it actually is? Capacity issues, and now the role of bipartisanship on oversight. So we covered an awful lot of ground. And Jason, your paper really, it's the first I've seen that takes a particular committee and looks at it over a period of decades. And I just found that a fascinating approach. But it just shows you how much more there is to look at. So we are out of time, but I want to thank you very much for this wonderful discussion and for the scholarship that's gone on and for the scholarship that may come to be because as a result of some of the work that you've done and some of the new techniques that you've pioneered. I mean, reading opening, hearing statements, as somebody worked on those really hard. I love that. So thank you so much, Professor MacDonald and Professor Theriault. We just really appreciate your being here today and for widening the horizons and deepening our understanding of oversight. And we appreciate it. So the Levin Center thanks you. And we hope all of you out there will be competing for that next round of Oversight Scholarship Research Award into the Excellence on Oversight Research. So thanks, everybody. Have a good day.